Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel once again. So today we are going to discuss about the topic cell membrane and the transportation which are occurring through the cell membrane. Okay, so all of you can take out your notebook so that you can note down the important points and let's start today's session. So cell membrane is also called as plasma membrane and it is also called as selectively permeable membrane, right? So can you tell me students in which cell the cell membrane is the outermost covering in the animal cell, right? So in the animal cell, cell membrane is the outermost covering. In the plant cell, cell wall is the outermost covering. So cell membrane is basically present in like every cell from prokaryote to the eukaryote. Every cell, every kind of cell, the cell membrane is present. Okay, so that's why this is also called as the basic component or basic unit of the cell. Okay, now, the cell membrane is composed of the lipids, the phospholipid bilayer, and some proteins are present in the cell membrane. Okay, and this lipids and the proteins ratio can vary from cell to cell. Okay, so Singer and Nicholson in the year 1972 they proposed the fluid mosaic model of the plasma membrane. Now, what is this fluid mosaic model? So see, as I told you that plasma membrane is made up of phospholipid bilayers. Bilayers means two layers are there. Okay, so here you can see this is the lipid. Looks like it has a hydrophilic head. Hydrophilic means water loving head, and the tail is hydrophobic means it is water hating or water repelling. So the tail is always present in the inward direction and the head is always present in the outward direction. Okay, so it looks like this. It takes a structure of like this, and as this is made up of like lipids, phospholipids, so it's not rigid structure. It's a kind of very flexible structure. Okay, it's fluid like, so that's why he named it as a fluid. And from where the mosaic word comes from, so here you can see there are so many different types of proteins like globular proteins, glycoproteins, channel proteins, then carrier proteins. All of these different types of proteins are embedded in the phospholipid bilayer, and this is the reason that it appears to be a mosaic-like structure. Okay, so that's how the name comes for fluid mosaic model. So the structure of the plasma membrane is called as fluid mosaic model. One more diagram you can see here. So you see there's cholesterol is also present. So cholesterol is not always bad thing. Okay, so cholesterol is helpful in maintaining the stability of the plasma membrane. Okay, because it's a fluid structure, flexible structure, so it maintains the shape of the plasma membrane. Same for the cytoskeleton filaments also. Cytoskeleton filaments, they also maintain the shape of the plasma membrane. Clear? Now, what is the function of the plasma membrane? So it plays a very important functions. So there are so many important functions. The first is it is the outermost covering, so it is a kind of physical barrier. Okay, so it is separating the internal environment of the cell from the external environment, and it also prevents the entry of any unwanted substance or unwanted, any pathogens also. So, not only the pathogen, it also prevents the entry of any unwanted, like inorganic substance, also any kind of ions or anything. Okay, so this is the reason that it is acting as a physical barrier. It is also supporting the cell structure, and it is also called as the selectively permeable membrane. So selectively permeable membrane means it is helping in the it is just allowing the entry of some selective molecules. Okay. For example, if you want to go to any cinema hall, PVR to watch any movie, so what happens? You have to purchase a ticket, right? And if somebody do not have ticket, guard is not going to allow them. So only selective people can enter. Correct? So similarly, plasma membrane also just say that, okay, I'm just going to allow some selective molecules. Not all the molecules can enter. Okay. And what kind of selective molecules? Like water, oxygen, carbon dioxide. Some ions are there, for example, calcium ions, potassium ions, okay, and sodium ions. These kind of ions are there, okay. So they are basically allowing some selective particles. That's why they are called as selectively permeable membrane. The next function of the plasma membrane is endocytosis and the exocytosis. So in some of the cells, we can see this process. For example, in the amoeba, in the WBC, white blood cell, you can see this process. Okay, they engulf the food particles. All right. For example, uh, endocytosis is when the cell is engulfing some large molecule, and exocytosis means when the cell is just ejecting out those molecules or the waste products. Cell signaling is a very important thing which is done by the plasma membrane, and it is basically used for the communication purpose. Like we communicate. How do we communicate? We have some languages, English or any other language, okay? But how the cells are communicating among themselves? They communicate through some signals, or they use some ions also for the communication. Okay, that is called as the cell signaling process. So let's do watch a video for a better clarification. All right, let's see this.
All cells are completely surrounded by a membrane that separates them from their environment, kind of like how your skin completely covers your body. This cell membrane is sometimes called the plasma membrane, and it acts as a barrier, regulating what gets in and out of the cell. Because the membrane lets some things through but not others, we say that the membrane is semi-permeable or selectively permeable. If we zoom in on the membrane, we can see that it is made of several molecular parts. Most of the membrane is made of molecules called phospholipids. Phospholipids have a head made of phosphate and two tails made of fatty acids. The heads are hydrophilic, meaning that they are attracted to water, or literally water-loving. The tails, however, are hydrophobic, meaning that they repel water. Literally, hydrophobic means water-fearing. Because of these properties, phospholipids form two layers known as a phospholipid bilayer, with the hydrophobic tails facing each other and the hydrophilic heads facing the watery external environment and the watery cytoplasm inside of the cell. So the water lovers get to be next to water, and the water fearers can hide away from it. A perfect arrangement. The phospholipid bilayer is the main component of the membrane, and it is largely responsible for making the membrane semi-permeable. Basically, the smaller and less charged something is, the easier it is to pass through the phospholipid bilayer. Bigger, more charged things have a harder time. A second membrane component is cholesterol. Although people often think of cholesterol as a bad thing, it's actually a very important part of cell membranes, where it helps to stabilize the membrane and make it better at controlling what can pass through it. Proteins are another important part of the membrane. They do many functions, but one of the most important ones is transporting materials across the membrane, especially if they have a hard time passing through the phospholipid bilayer. A fourth membrane component is carbohydrates. These are often involved in cell identification. Blood types, for example, are the result of membrane carbohydrates attached to proteins. These help you to identify blood that belongs to you and distinguish it from foreign invaders. All of these components work together to make the plasma membrane that surrounds all cells, a critically important barrier needed for all life on Earth.
All right, so I hope that is clear to you. Now, students, tell me, have you ever gone for trekking anywhere in any hilly areas or any mountain regions? If you have tried trekking, what happens when you are going upward? So, like here, you are here, okay, and now you're going upward, and you reaches at the top of the hill, okay. And what happens when you are coming down? What happens? So first of all, you are moving from low to high, and in the next you are, coming down. So you are moving from high to low, right? So when you are moving from low to high, do you require lot of energy? Yes, you do, right? So when you're moving from low to high, you require a lot amount of energy. Okay, but when you're coming down, do you require that much amount of energy? No, right? So here, no energy is required. The same thing occurs with the molecules also. When the molecules are moving from lower concentration gradient to a higher concentration gradient, this require a lot of energy. Okay, and energy comes from where? The ATP, adenosine triphosphate, that is the energy currency of our body. Correct? So this kind of transportation is called as active transportation. And when the molecules are moving from higher to lower concentration gradient, they do not require any ATP energy, and this is called as passive transportation. Okay, so the molecules are moving in, like, there are two types of transportation of the molecules: active transport and the passive transport. So here you can see now the cell transport are two types, active and passive. In the passive, we will study about simple diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. In the active, we will be studying about the pump and the vesicles. Okay, vesicles like the exocytosis and endocytosis. So we are going to discuss about all of these. All right. Okay. Now moving on to the passive transport. So in the passive transport, what happens? There are three different types: simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and the osmosis. Here, no energy is required. Okay, why? Because molecules move from higher concentration to lower concentration gradient. So let's talk about the simple diffusion first. So students, tell me, like, if have you ever used any room freshener? So, if you spray a little bit amount of room freshener at one corner of the room, what happens? That fragrance is going to spread in all the room, all over the room. How does that happens? That is the process of diffusion. Okay? So basically in the diffusion, the molecules of the that room freshener, the aerosols of that room freshener, it moves from the higher concentration gradient where you have sprayed, there was the higher concentration, to the lower concentration, like that's the whole room. Okay, and without any semi permeable membrane, it occurs. So, in the simple diffusion, gases like oxygen, carbon dioxide, okay, not only the gases, the solute or the solvent also, they spread from high to lower concentration gradient, and the membrane is actually not necessary here. Okay, but in the facilitated diffusion, what happens? There are some bigger size molecules which require some extra help. They just cannot move by themselves. Okay, so here comes the carrier protein or the channel proteins, which basically help the bigger size molecules for the transportation process, which occurs in the case of glucose transportation in the muscle cells. Okay, so that is the facilitated diffusion. In the osmosis, what happens? Only the solvent, that is the water. Water is a universal solvent. So solvent molecules are passing from higher concentration to lower concentration. No requirement of energy again. But here the semi-permeable membrane is required. It's necessary. Okay, so this is osmosis. Here you can see in the picture, passive transport two types, simple and the facilitated diffusion. Simple diffusion, this can easily pass through, but in the facilitated diffusion, helping proteins, or the channel proteins or the carrier proteins are required. Okay. Next will be the active transport, where it requires the ATP energy. So let's watch another video for a better clarification.
In this video, we will be discussing passive transport. Passive transport is when particles move through the cell membrane from an area of higher concentration to lower concentration without the use of energy, also described as movement along the concentration gradient. What are the types of passive transport? They are diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. We'll describe diffusion first, using the solution in this container. A solution is a liquid with something dissolved in it. The aqua color represents the solvent, meaning the liquid part of the solution. The yellow particles represent the dissolved substance, called the solute. The structure in the middle of the container represents a semi-permeable cell membrane, a barrier through which only certain sized particles can pass freely. It's important to note that although diffusion often occurs across the cell membrane, diffusion can happen with or without a semi-permeable membrane. Right now, there is more solute on the left than there is on the right. Because solute particles are able to pass through the semi-permeable membrane, they are going to naturally move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. They will continue to do this until both sides of the container have about equal numbers of solute particles. This is called achieving a state of equilibrium. Let's review what we've covered so far. Diffusion is when particles move from an area of high concentration to low concentration. This just happens. It's a natural process that doesn't use any energy. Here's an example of diffusion happening without a semi-permeable membrane. If you spray air freshener in a room, people near you smell it right away. But after a short time, depending on the size of the room, people farther away will also begin to smell it. This is because the little scented molecules are trying to achieve equilibrium by spreading evenly throughout the room. Remember, diffusion is a natural process, like a ball rolling down a hill. The ball's movement is automatic and doesn't require any energy. Osmosis is diffusion that happens with water molecules. Let's look at another container in which the solvent is water, but the solute particles are larger. The membrane in this container has openings that are too small for the solute to move through, but water can pass through the membrane freely. This time, we'll focus on the concentration gradient of the water rather than the solute particles. Although the large solute particles can't pass through the membrane, the water molecules are small enough to pass through. The water moves freely from its area of high concentration to low concentration until equilibrium is reached. Equilibrium means that the proportion of water to solute particles is about the same on both sides of the membrane. In the cell, osmosis means diffusion of water through the cell membrane. Water can enter or leave the cell through the membrane until the cell achieves a state of equilibrium with its surroundings. So, like diffusion, osmosis is passive. No energy is required. It just happens automatically. Facilitated diffusion is a type of passive transport in which molecules diffuse through specialized protein channels in the cell membrane. The protein channels work like special ports or tunnels that allow these substances in or out of the cell. Facilitated diffusion is also when particles move from high concentration to low concentration. How do you know that? From the word diffusion. Facilitated diffusion works naturally, without added energy, just like the diffusion example we discussed earlier. But facilitated diffusion generally happens with particles a bit larger than those that can seep through the cell membrane's phospholipid layers. So they move in or out of the cell along the concentration gradient in a specialized way, through protein channels. In summary, passive transport is a natural process that doesn't require the cell to expend any energy. The types of passive transport are diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion.
All right, so I hope that is clear to all of you. Now let's move on to the next topic, that is the active transport. So in the active transport, energy is required. Okay, why? Because the molecules are moving from lower to higher concentration gradient. So we can call it as a like against the concentration gradient. Okay, so here comes the first, that is the endocytosis. What is endocytosis? Let's see this. So for example, like there is a amoeba. How the amoeba eats food? Suppose there is a food. How amoeba eat food? It just, surround its pseudopodia. Okay, here is the food particle and here is the pseudopodia. Okay, pseudopodia is the false bead. So it traps the food particle like this, and it will make a food vacuole surrounding the food particle. So this is how this is the endocytosis. It's engulfing the food particle. Okay, and it is bringing it into the cell. Now, how this is the endocytosis process. Now, what will happen after eating and the digestion, absorption, assimilation, like the last step, that is the digestion, right? So now the waste products are going to, like, they are going to collected in a vesicle. Okay, and this vesicle gradually moves towards the plasma membrane. It merges with the plasma membrane, and then all of these waste products are just out of the cell. Okay, this process is called as exocytosis. The cell releases content of the vesicles to the outside of the cell by fusing the vesicles with the plasma membrane. I hope this is clear to all of you. One more thing, endocytosis has two types. Okay, one is the phagocytosis and another is the pinocytosis. Okay, so if amoeba is eating something, that is called as phagocytosis. So this phagocytosis is basically cell eating, and pinocytosis is cell drinking. Okay, like if there is the food is basically in the fluid form, so an amoeba is consuming that food, so that will be called as pinocytosis. Okay, let's watch this video again for a better clarification.
In this video, we'll discuss active transport. Active transport is when particles move from an area of low concentration to high concentration. This is also known as moving against the concentration gradient. The key thing to remember is that active transport requires energy. If passive transport is like a ball naturally rolling down a hill, active transport is the opposite. You can get the ball back up the hill, but you're going to have to expend some energy to do it. Cells require this type of substance movement in order to function properly. For example, heart muscle cells, responsible for making your heart beat, move molecules or ions against their concentration gradient. So, what are some of the main types of active transport? We have endocytosis, exocytosis, and protein pumps. Sometimes a cell uses active transport to pull in large particles using its cell membrane. This is called endocytosis. One type of endocytosis is called phagocytosis. This often happens when the cell takes in some type of nutrient. In another type of endocytosis, called pinocytosis, the cell takes in fluids by creating pockets in the cell membrane. The cell can ingest a large amount of fluid this way by pinching off these cell membrane pockets into the cytoplasm. The opposite of endocytosis is exocytosis. Exocytosis is when something needs to exit the cell. The cell can remove large molecules or wastes this way by fusing the membrane-bound vesicles containing them with the cell membrane, forcing them out of the cell. A good way to remember that exocytosis is a way for things to leave the cell is that it shares the first two letters with exit. You can also remember that endocytosis is a way for things to move into the cell because it shares the first two letters with enter. Sometimes the cell uses special protein pumps to move small molecules or ions against the concentration gradient into or out of the cell. An example of this is the sodium-potassium pump. In this process, the pump uses energy in the form of ATP molecules to move sodium ions out of the cell, and then move potassium ions into the cell. Protein pumps used in active transport require energy because the molecules or ions are moving from an area of low concentration to high concentration. In summary, active transport is when the cell uses energy to move substances in or out of the cell against the concentration gradient via endocytosis, exocytosis, or protein pumps.
All right, students. So I hope that is clear to you about the endocytosis and exocytosis. Next type of active transport is through the protein pump. Okay. So here also ATP is required. All right. Now, what happens in the protein pump? There are basically two categories: primary active transport and the secondary active transport. So in the primary active transport, the ATP is directly used as an energy source. okay, and which is driving the transport of the molecules across the membrane. So it is directly used, for example, in the case of sodium potassium pump. Okay, now, but in the secondary active transport, ATP is not directly used. So basically, in the secondary active transport occurs after the primary active transport only, and it uses the energy produced in the primary active transport for the secondary active transport. Okay, like the when the sodium is moving, like here, let me draw this. So this is the pump. Sodium is moving in this direction, sodium ions. Three sodium ions are moving in this direction, and then one potassium ion is going to move in the opposite direction. All right. So it is so basically when the sodium is moving the downhill, all right. So the energy of this downhill movement is used to move the other solute in the uphill direction. Okay. So that is basically the primary active transport. All right. But in the secondary active transport, what happens? This energy is going to move the other solute in the uphill direction. So for example, in case of glucose, the sodium is moving like here along the concentration gradient. All right. This is the downhill, and this energy is going to utilized in the movement of this glucose, which is against the concentration gradient, and both of them are moving in the same direction, so this is called as the symport. All right, and in the symport basically it is also coupled up. So here you can see the secondary active transport, it is also called as coupled transport or co-transport. Why this is called as co-transport? Because here it is coupled up with the another type of uni-transport. All right, there is going to be a pump which only allows one kind of molecule, that is called as uni-transport. And here these pumps are allowing two different types of molecules like sodium and glucose, right? So they are coupling up with a kind of uniport. So that is that's why it is also called as like co-transport, or this is also called as symport. One more thing is the antiport in the case of secondary active transport. Antiport is in antipode, as you can see, the calcium ions are moving in the opposite direction. All right, so sodium is moving in this direction, calcium ion is moving in the opposite direction, so this is the antipode. I hope this is clear to you. Let's see this picture over here. So this is the basically protein ATPase, all right, and this is like acting as a pump. So here this is the primary transport where three ions of sodium is moving in this direction, and the one ion of potassium is moving in this direction. Here you can see this is coupled up. There are two pumps are there. So this is a coupled transport or co-transport. Let's watch a video for a better clarification. Okay.
A uniport is an active transport protein that transports a single molecule or a group of the same molecules in one direction against the concentration gradient. These proteins are also ATPases, using ATP to drive the transport. An antiport is an active transport protein that transports two molecules in opposite directions against their concentration gradients. These proteins are also ATPases, using ATP to drive the transport. An example of an antiport protein channel is a sodium-potassium gated channel that maintains the electrochemical gradient of cells, which is responsible for maintaining a voltage difference between the outside and the inside of the cell. A symport is an active transport protein that transports two different molecules across the cell membrane at the same time. In this case, it's coupled with a uniport channel that uses ATP to actively transport a molecule against its concentration gradient. When those same molecules are in high concentration outside the cell, their diffusion back into the cell provides energy to transport a different molecule against its concentration gradient through the symport.
All right. So I hope that is clear to all of you. Now let's have a quick summary what we have discussed today. Today we have discussed about the plasma membrane, its structure, the fluid mosaic model, okay, and the function of the plasma membrane, and we discuss about the passive and the active transport. So here is some differences between passive and active transport. The passive transport we discussed about the diffusion, osmosis and facilitated diffusion, and it all of these do not require any energy because it is having it is getting like transporting down the concentration gradient. Okay, no pump is required. Example is like the transportation of oxygen and the carbon dioxide across the alveoli. Alveoli is present in the lungs. Okay. Active transport, we discussed about endocytosis, exocytosis, and the pumps. Okay, here energy is required. It is happening against the concentration gradient that is low to high. Okay, it requires the protein pumps. For example, glucose absorption in the ileum. Ileum is the part of the small intestine. Okay. So all of these we have done in the today's session. So if you like the like today's topic, please share this with your friends. Okay, and hit the like button also. All right, thank you all of you for watching my video. Okay, so take care, have a nice day. Until then, you can keep watching my other videos. All right, so take care. Bye bye.